Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot Podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by Megan Gerhardt. She's the professor of management and leadership at Miami University and co-author of Gentelligence, a revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce. And I'm really fired up for this conversation because we're going to talk about how do you manage a workforce that has multiple generations, multiple needs, multiple approaches to work. And I know for me, this is a thread that has definitely been pulled on this pod. We've talked a lot about this. I know schools are really trying to figure out how do you create, workplaces that are cognizant of different generations, and it's a struggle. It's hard. It's not easy. And so I'm really happy that Megan has agreed to come on to the pod to talk about this. This is her area of study. I can't think of a better person to have kind of break this all down for us. So with all that, Megan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Me too. This is really a conversation that I've had versions of this conversations with multiple heads of school over the last couple of years. And we're going to get into all this in just a second. But before we do, can you introduce yourself and your book?
Sure. So I am Megan Gerhardt, as you said, professor of management and leadership at the Farmer School of Business at Miami University. I also am the founder of Gentelligence.org, which is really designed to help people have smarter intergenerational conversations, push back on generational stereotypes, and leverage all that great different diversity of experience as an opportunity instead of the way we normally kind of look at it, which is as a frustration. So as you said, I wrote the book Gentelligence with two of my co-authors who were Millennials. So it's in generational range in that co-author team and speak with organizations all over the world about how to approach this topic in hopefully a more productive way.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because I know when you just hear it framed as generational conflict a lot. Oh, they just don't understand. They don't understand me, or I don't understand them. I pick up on that vibe pretty frequently. But you're saying that that's actually that issue is often misdiagnosed. So, what do leaders usually get wrong when they frame workforce challenges around just pure generational lines?
Yeah, I think, there's somehow this us versus them mentality that has been perpetuated by the media. I think we are led to believe that we are really entrenched in some sort of generational war. You can see these awful clickbait headlines of, it's been around. I always say, like, pun intended, it's an age-old issue. This isn't a new challenge. We can go back, anytime into the 20th century, and I'm sure before that, and see headlines and articles bemoaning the shortcomings of the next generation. We it's very much a predictable cycle, but there's a lot of, I think, maybe attraction in blaming and shaming. I always say if something isn't changing fast enough, we like to blame older generations. If it's changing too quickly in a way that makes us uncomfortable, then that is something we blame the younger generations for. And I think from a leadership perspective, we have to just reframe the fact that you're sitting on a significant amount of talent potential. There is something very intriguing and interesting beyond stereotypes about working with people who grew up in different periods of time. It's a different lived experience. It comes with different ways of communicating, different ways of finding information, different ways of viewing problems. And I think as leaders, we know that's good. We know there's a potential there if we can leverage it. But like any kind of difference, if we don't manage it well, we don't create a culture where my age and experience is considered unique and valuable and valid, and so is yours, and so is, somebody 40 years older than me, and vice versa, then we are leaving a lot on the table. And so I think first and foremost, it's the reframing of what is often looked at as a threat as a hidden opportunity. I think that's the first thing, is we say, wow, you're right. We're not all competing or in some sort of battle that we weren't made aware of. We simply may just have different approaches to problems or situations. And of course that can create tension and conflict. But if we can manage that well, it can also be advantageous.
What are some ways in which, leaders can approach that management process? Like it sounds like a lot of cultural work has to happen. What are some foundational things that they should be thinking about?
I think I love pointing to there's some academic research, not mine, but some academic research that shows if the people that you work with, so for example, the people in your school believe that their age, and I speak about generation, age, and life stage kind of in a way that's very intertwined. It's hard to untangle that. And in these concepts that I talk about are applicable to any of those. So if we think about the fact that in your school, for example, you're going to have multiple layers of generational and age differences that you have to pay attention to, not only your teachers, your staff, but also your students, the parents of your students, like, your stakeholders, your community, all of those different things. The research shows if we create that culture where age is seen as a benefit, um, and I don't believe my age is holding me back from getting hired, getting promoted, being able to learn, to develop. I'm allowed to have an opinion regardless of if I'm 22 or 42 or 62. My opinion is still seen as valid and important. Then we start seeing age and generational differences turn into an asset. They help with retention, they help with innovation, they help with adjustment to change, performance, teams, all those great things that we as leaders care about. So I think a lot of it really comes down to we have 4 practices we talk about in the book. And the first one that we can start with is the idea of what assumptions are being made around what people are either capable of, believe, want based on generation. So that's where I push back on those awful like cookie cutter infographics or things you see on LinkedIn or, written up about everyone who's a Gen Z feels this way, acts this way, needs to be managed the following way. All boomers, anytime we see all people in a generation, considered one thing, we should definitely pause because that's, 70 million people, give or take, who do not all want the same thing or have identical lived experiences. And we've really gone wrong in that direction. And so what I like to say is like, we don't want to put people in a box based on the year they were born. That's a very simplistic way of looking at our people. But at the same time, we absolutely have, reason to believe that the time in which you were born does have an impact on the way you're probably seeing life and career and the things that are important to you. And I think the best way as leaders to reframe that from the beginning is to say, let's think about generational norms. So anyone who's taught for a long time, right? Like I've seen different waves of generational norms come and go. I started teaching 23 years ago. So I saw the millennials come. They felt different in many interesting ways to my generation. I saw them move out and Gen Z's coming, and soon we're going to have, Gen Alpha. And they're all very different people. But the norms, the things that they tend to believe or have experienced, or the way that they maybe approach different issues, those do ebb and flow over time. I can say that more people in my generation believed something compared to my parents or my son's generation, right? That's what a generational norm means, that my generation felt a particular way at a higher frequency about certain issues. And that really makes a difference. I think the first thing that we as leaders can do is really check our assumptions. If we're assuming all millennials are entitled, all Gen Zs are fragile snowflakes, all boomers are resistant to change and can't use tech, like all of those horrible age-based stereotypes, that is the low-hanging fruit that we first need to say, where are we making decisions or policy or acting in a way that has maybe some age-based bias associated with it? I think that's the first thing, is just to kind of raise awareness on that. And then the second thing I'll say, and this is just our first practice, so we can dig into some of the others if you want, is I really also like asking, where are we assuming across generations that we are having the same conversation when in fact we might be having entirely different conversations? So that's a different kind of assumption than a bias.
Well, can you frame that for me? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, let's say that in your school, you're having a lot of conversations about transparency. And we're talking a lot about, geez, our younger staff is really pushing for more transparency, or our parents of our students seem to want more transparency than we've really been willing to provide in the past. I always like to push pause and say, let's just hold on for a second. We've been using that word a lot, transparency. So when I say transparency, Peter, what does that mean to you? Like, what are you thinking about? And that word could be switched out for success, development, communication,
Right.
flexibility, whatever, like the $1 million phrase or challenges we're talking about. Very often we assume, just like we might generalize that people of different generations are entirely different than us, we also can err in the other direction and assume that when I say, I'm going to need you to do a better job communicating, that you define that the same way as me. Professionalism is a big one I hear these days, right? What has happened to professionalism? Work ethic. Young people today have no work ethic, quote unquote. And I always think, what does that mean? That's a subjective term. They absolutely have a work ethic. It might not fit your norms or definition of what it means to work hard enough, but their ethic is what they believe is the appropriate amount to put into their work. And those are shaped in part by the generation you grow up with. And so I love the opportunity to simply ask the question.
Hmm.
When I say, development, if you have younger staff saying, I still feel like there's opportunities here for me to develop, and older leadership might be scratching their heads and thinking, what are they talking about? We have, training, we have mentoring, what are they talking about? That is a fantastic intergenerational conversation to have. Like, I've heard you say that you're frustrated that there's not enough development opportunities. Can you help me understand what that means to you? Okay, can you help me understand is one of my favorite kind of Gentelligence power questions, because I'm acknowledging that there's probably a big chance you're looking at this different than me, and I'm interested in understanding that better before I then jump to judge it as wrong, or make a decision that might send us in an entirely unproductive direction. So I think that's where I would start, is the assumptions in both directions of where we might be either generalizing in ways that aren't productive or getting wires crossed in ways we don't realize.
Yeah, what I really appreciate about that is, at least if I'm hearing it correctly, is like get to the root issue, right? Like what somebody may be saying may not necessarily be the thing that you're thinking. And rather than rush to a solution, really dig in so that you can have a shared understanding of what you're trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the skills I try to work with my students on a lot is, what problem do we need to solve?
I love it. Yeah.
And that's, life skill right there, right? It's a hard one for all of us. And if I think we just haven't talked enough about the need for, really, proactive development of our people, I'm going to be acting differently than if I realize the problem is development to my young staff means being promoted very quickly and having, upward mobility at a rate that we aren't prepared to support. That's a different problem to solve, and getting at the root of that, I think, is so important. And we already sort of transitioned into, so our first practice is resisting assumptions. The second practice we already sort of seamlessly jumped to is adjusting your lens. So if I start to sense, like, I think maybe we're having different conversation, and I say to you, can we back up? Can you help me understand? You keep saying you're not getting enough development. What does that mean to you? And then saying questions like, I feel like you might be defining development in a way that's different than me. Can I share what I mean when I say development, right? So not only am I adjusting my lens as a leader, that should be a two-way street where I'm providing, fascinating. Thank you for sharing it. That's really helpful for me to realize we might be talking about something different. I'd love to tell you where I'm coming from, or where we as a school have always, defined development as blank. It seems like maybe we're not having the same discussion as I thought we were having. And so I think it's really about, maybe a great metaphor for us to think about is generations are a kind of culture. And I think at this point, many of us understand when we travel somewhere very different, we are going to encounter people who grew up a bit different. They speak a different language, they have different norms, and we tend to work harder to make sure we're not misunderstanding or misunderstood because we acknowledge and respect there's a lot of good reasons why we might be looking at this situation differently than the people we're interacting with. That is exactly what Gentelligence is about, that I am fascinated by our cultural difference rather than irritated by it, and that I'm willing to work a little harder to understand the problem that we need to solve rather than assuming you are the problem because your norms don't seem to be aligning with mine. I think that's the real leadership mindset we need to work on.
If you don't mind, I want to back up for just a second. I want to get through the full spectrum of practices for sure. But before we do, you had mentioned, there's this kind of trope of like, well, Gen Z wants this, millennials want that, Gen X wants, this other thing. And, or they feel this way, 70 million people feel the same way, which is like a really dangerous way to approach things. But you did mention norms. And so I guess the question I have is, like, how do you know which norms, like, how do you validate the norms? How do you know which norms to pay attention to and which norms are, it's probably not something that we should give a lot of time to?
Yeah, what a great question. I think norms are a starting place the same way, I always say, a friend of mine once said, generations are a great start to the conversation, but we don't want it to be the end of the conversation. So I think what I love is in the first two practices, I think help us do this is I might start sensing or feel like something is a generational issue because it feels new. Or if I'm a younger person, because this works in both directions, I feel like we're seeing our younger people on our team feel a certain way, but then in dealing with my older colleagues, it feels very different, right? So if I start to get the sense as a leader, I think there might be a generational root to this.
Yeah.
We want to be really careful we don't stereotype, but we want to kind of go down that path. And I like to think about generations as one layer of your identity. That's how we make it a starting point. So I can say, okay, interestingly, these people on our team started teaching, 30 years before these people on our team. So that's really interesting. There's certainly going to be generational influences to this conversation, age differences, life stage differences that we probably need to pull in. But what else, right? So I think the difference between a norm and a stereotype is a norm is a frequency where our younger staff tend to emphasize this or want this more so than our older staff, even though that's not true for every person, right? There's themes, there's trends, there's sort of interesting things that can give us a starting point. But then on our own organizations, let's explore that more deeply to make sure we're not generalizing or thinking we're very far apart when we're not. So I also love the idea of looking at other layers of our identity. So maybe it's that some of our people that, work with us, maybe there's different cultural differences around different socioeconomic status or where people went to school or what part of the world they grew up in or whatever it might be, right? Or some of the people might say, well, yes, I've been teaching here a long time, but my view on education is very much influenced by the fact that, I study this way of teaching versus that way of teaching, right? So we can use it as a starting point, I think is a great way not to jump right away to, well, clearly it's because you're a Gen Xer and you don't understand blank. So I think the norms are really interesting. I think the questions that we ask allow us to use those generations as a starting point. And say, I feel like those of you who joined us, within the last 5 years might look at this challenge in a way that feels to me a little different than how we used to talk about it. I'd love to explore whether that's true or not. Like where is the disconnect?
Yeah.
The other thing that it really brings into light for me is I like to say, research very clearly supports, because I love how you said, like, how do we validate norms? And one of the things, if you look at the academic research on generational differences, like you will quickly find that many people feel there are not any. We've had a horrible time validating generational differences in values or needs or job satisfaction or any of these things, to the point where there's been sort of a call for a moratorium, like just stop looking, it's all fake news. I know that's not true because this is the work I do for a living, but I believe, and I'm in process of trying to figure out how to show this empirically. I think the key comes down to the fact that all people, regardless of age or generation, actually have very similar intrinsic needs in the workplace or in the classroom. So we all need, research supports, we need to be respected. We need to feel connected to other people. We want to have autonomy or agency over our lives and our work, whether we're 7, 17, 47, 77. And so if you looked at differences on those, we wouldn't find very many, most likely. That's what our research suggests. So what are we missing? I think what we're missing is, while I may have a very strong need to be respected, the norms I learned growing up as a Gen Xer about how that occurs, or the right way to earn respect, or what the right path is to make that happen, likely look quite different than the norm my 77-year-old father learned about how one earns respect, or my 20-year-old students. So the story I tell, when our book came out, my dad is a retired attorney, and he said, when I was starting out, the way that you got ahead is you put your head down, you closed your mouth, and you did your work. And when you had earned it, someone would come tap you on the shoulder and tell you it was time for your promotion. It was time for your raise. And he said, fast forward to when I was getting ready to retire, these young people, and it was millennials, that would have been millennials at the time that he retired, these young people were coming and telling me it was time for their promotion. I don't get that, right? It was like that hashtag entitled. And so it was such a great example of this, because I said, all right, so you had a need to earn respect. And the way you learned that happened is you put your head down, did your work, closed your mouth, waited. It happened, right? That was the norm to get ahead. You did that. It worked. It was a successful strategy. Fast forward, millennials who also have that same need to be respected learn growing up the time they did, when there was a lot of increased pressure, a lot of development and advancement for children at ages we had never seen before, pressure to be like, founder of a nonprofit before you even applied to college, right? Like all of these norms changed. They want respect, but what they learned as a norm, not by the person, is you want that, you get up in the front of the line and put your hand up and tell people you're ready, or someone else is going to get it instead of you. So the need is the same.
So the conditions are different.
The conditions are different, and the norms that we believe work or we embrace as correct are entirely different in those examples. And what happens is we judge both directions that norm is wrong because it's not the one I learned or the one that I believe is right. And that's how we get, people being okay boomered, or Gen Zs or snowflakes or entitled millennials, because you're doing it in a way that we didn't do it. Who do you think you are? Right. And so instead of saying, oh, I get it, my young colleague is really desperate to move ahead, prove themselves, earn respect. And the norm they've learned is like, ask for it, be proactive, get up there, like level up as quick as possible. That's not really how we're set up here to do that, but I definitely understand where that drive is coming from. So I want to start there, right? And then we can start to have a more productive conversation, which kind of leads into the later practices about how can we take what you want and how we do things here, and how do we sort of move forward in a way where we're going to help people meet their needs, but in a way that makes sense for this place.
Well, let's talk about those later practices. I'd love to dig in.
Great. So once we sort of the first two recap: resisting assumptions, adjusting the lens, right? We're making sure that we're not getting anything crossed or we don't have misunderstanding. So then we want to work on, assuming we're at neutral, how do we build generational differences into an opportunity and a strength? And the third practice we talk about is strengthening trust. So, unfortunately, trust is hard to come by, no matter what, but it's even harder with people we perceive to be different than ourselves. And generation is a very visible sign that you might not share a lot of similarities with me. That's sort of our human inclination. We also know that people don't tend to have a lot of opportunity to get to know colleagues well who are substantially older or younger. We don't move through our careers on the same trajectory. We tend to sort of have friends at work that are rather close in age to us. And that really limits our opportunity to break down some of those barriers to trust, right? Because if I didn't work with Gen Zs every day, I would be much less inclined to push back on stereotypes about them, for example. And so the strengthening trust is about psychological safety, that most leaders are familiar with that concept. Just the idea that you have to really believe that you are on a team and in a place where you can ask for help if you need it, whether you're an older person who is really interested in learning AI, but there's some foundational things that you probably would love some help on to get to that point. You don't want to be afraid to ask because you don't want somebody to call you a dinosaur or okay boomer you when you are very interested in doing this, but would like some support. The same way a younger person shouldn't be ashamed to ask for help if they don't know how to do something that older generations maybe think is fundamental and can't believe they don't know how to do. I had an example, a client I was working with who ran a restaurant was saying, well, these Gen Zs are coming and they don't even know how to mop a floor, right? Like super shaming, and I said, all right, well, absolutely. If you need them to mop a floor, they should be expected to mop a floor. But there may be very good reasons why they're not walking in knowing how to do that the way that maybe some other generations did, right? Maybe they're playing travel soccer 6 days a week and there just has not been time to learn to mop the floor. Maybe people don't mop the floor the way that they used to. I don't know, but let's not shame someone for needing help and support that we didn't need at their age or stage. So that, and also, and the other side of psychological safety is you have to believe and trust that you can speak up and share ideas and viewpoints, and they're not going to be rejected as entitled or outdated, or someone's not going to swipe your idea, right? You really have to believe that's true. And there's some really interesting generationally and age-related things there where older people are more reluctant to ask for help and younger people are less likely to speak up out of fear they're going to be called entitled. And think about what we might be missing. So I think the strengthening trust practice for leaders, how do we make our people feel like their age is and their generation is a value add? And that if their needs are something that are different than maybe someone else's who's older or younger, that those are still valid. And the power questions we have on that are things like, what barriers exist here for you that might be getting in the way of you contributing as much as you would like? Or what resources might be helpful for you at this stage in your career to really help you move forward? And it's not like a wand, like we think you're going to be able to give everyone absolutely everything they want or need.
No.
But again, it goes back to your earlier point. What problem do we need to solve? If I think you have everything you need for your development and you're sitting there thinking, why hasn't anyone assigned me a mentor and taken me to lunch to learn about my career goals? I didn't know that was the problem that I was supposed to be helping solve. And so the strengthening trust one is just really about creating environments where that multi-generational team is willing to maybe lean on one another and not fear that their differences are going to be the source of judgment. So that would be the third practice. And then the fourth one is maybe my favorite. It's sort of where we wrap them all up together. And it's called expanding the pie. That's what we called it in the book. So it's like a negotiations concept of how do we take this from a win-lose to a win-win, right? We're not actually in a generational tug of war. If we could replace the us versus them or the then versus now mentality that we sometimes get locked into in our organizations with a plus, how would that change the game? And I always just say really, really straightforwardly, I am better at my job because I have learned things from people older and younger. So not only was it good for them, I think to be asked and in their opinion to be valued and considered, it helped me. It wasn't a selfless act, And so how can we get curious about the strategies and viewpoints and approaches of people from other generations, thinking that if that could complement what I know and think and have seen, then we might have something really interesting. And that's where you get the opportunity, right? That us together are going to create something or solve a problem we couldn't solve alone.
Which is like so natural for a school, right? Because it's about providing different perspectives, different learning paths, whatnot. And this just is so consistent with everything that school is all about.
Yeah, that's what we hope, right? And I think I love modeling it with students. I think in education, when I get the opportunity to talk to whether it's independent schools, universities, we have sort of almost an extra layer of this at our disposal. And then sometimes an extra layer that we feel like is even more challenging, because particularly independent schools, you're seeing the next generation before anyone else. You're seeing what's coming down the pipeline, and we get to sort of say, oh, that's different or that's interesting. And that's where I think that term norm, right? Not every student is acting in a very different way than the last, wave of students we had come in. But some things are maybe feeling a little different. We're being asked for things at a different level, or this isn't coming up anymore. And I also think, the idea, and this is such a great maybe place for schools to experiment with this. In my classroom, at least once a week, I use my favorite expand the pie power question, which is, how would you approach this? So, for example, I'm working on my syllabus right now for next week. And at every semester for the last 2 or 3 years, I started with, well, the elephant in the room is you have, the ability to use AI on a lot of the things that before this, I assumed you were going to struggle as part of your learning process. So we need to figure out how we're going to approach this. And I could create a policy. I'm well within my rights, right, as the leader of the classroom to mandate how we do this. But I would rather co-create it together, because I believe you have interacted and understand things about this that I probably don't, and vice versa. So I think we're going to come up with a better approach together. And so I love the idea of asking them, how would you approach this? What would your policy be if you were sitting in my shoes? I have an assignment where I say, how's AI helping you learn? Right? Kind of flipping it on its head, because the assumption some of my colleagues have is like, we got to shut this down. But in fact, we know that's not real. It's just simply saying, how's it helping you learn? And I've had students say things like, I put all my papers through AI and ask, like, what bias exists here that I'm not aware of? And like, what teacher wouldn't be like, great, like, I'm so excited, like, I'm okay with that use. Or I asked it to look at my paper, outline it for me so I could tell whether there was, and suggest a way for it to flow better, right? Am I opposed to that? And then the flip conversation of what are you concerned about, right? What are you concerned about? Well, I'm concerned I'm not going to get a job because all the things I thought I was uniquely good at, everyone can now do by pushing a button. Or I'm concerned that somebody's going to think I'm cheating if I use it here, but over here, I'm required to use it. Just an example of me understanding where their heads are at, them understanding what I'm worried about. And then we've co-created something where I'm respecting that their view might be different than mine. And I don't find that threatening. I find that fascinating. And
You're creating the psychological safety that you talked about earlier.
Right. It's like, oh, if I can say to them, oh, I had not thought of that. I think older people, and I'm not going to put like an age limit on this, but I think the old school approach to leadership was pretend you know everything, right? Fake it till you make it. No one's going to respect you unless you know all the things. And over time, thankfully, I think we've begun to realize that that's a myth. Nobody wants to be led by someone, whether it's a teacher, a head of school, whoever it is, who thinks they know everything, and are not interested in our opinion. And so, I tell the story when we all had to go online for COVID, right? When we all had to have our classrooms ready in 5 minutes in ways that we had never, ever tried before. I had a dear colleague of mine who was he's probably 15 years older than me, and he's not a tech guy. Like, there are many older people who are tech people, but he is not one of them. And he was petrified about this shift. And he called me, to his credit. Like, we had the psychological safety enough that he asked for my help. And I said, here's what I know how to do. Here's what I'm going to do. And I just said at the end of the conversation, I'm sure we've missed something. No one had ever used Zoom before. And I said, if something doesn't work right, just ask your students for help. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just like punt in the moment and be like, anybody know why this isn't working? And he looked at me like I said, you should grow another head. He's like, I would never ask my students for help. And I said, why not? He said, well, they wouldn't respect me. And I thought, oh my gosh, that is so different than my experience, because I ask for help with little and big things all the time. One, because I need it. Like, I don't know why the sound's not working on this YouTube video. Can someone please fix this for me? But also because being asked for your expertise is how you engage people and help them get skin in the game. Like, now it's our class, right? It's not my class. It's our class. And so I just feel like that's such an important thing to remember, is that you're not doing it to be selfless. You're doing it because better outcomes for everyone are on the other side, potentially.
There's a question. Well, a couple things that really I've been thinking about as we've been talking here. One, I love the framing of a norm as a frequency. I think that's like such a smart, like, I get it. Like, that makes so much sense to me. And another thing that's been kind of stuck in my mind here for a little bit is, if you look at the data suggests that becoming a teacher is less appealing now than it was, say, 20 years ago. Just the number of degrees, coming out of education programs have, I think, almost halved in 20 plus years. And I think part of the explanation that I hear is that, well, there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is generational. That, working in a school is very much a brick and mortar experience. It's very rigid. It doesn't conform to, lifestyle choices and things like that. I just want to put that, I guess my question to you is, like, is that the right way to be thinking about it? Or is there another way to break down this challenge?
I would be really fascinated with what younger generations would say, right?
Mhm.
Because my thought was, well, when I was growing up, my mom was a teacher. And when I was growing up, to be a teacher, right? Like, that was a well-respected, noble enterprise. Like, we all had amazing teachers. And not only that, like, it meant something specific. And then when I think about now, my nephew became a teacher, and I'm hearing different students who want to go into that. And I think, wow, like, I'm so grateful, because to me, all the things that teachers now have to deal with seem to need to go way beyond what I understood a teacher to do, particularly at like the K to 12 level, like social worker and the bureaucracy and the funding and the things that maybe most of us on this podcast listening would agree shouldn't really be the responsibility of a teacher, but here we are, right? They have to be, somebody has to deal with it, and our teachers are often the ones that do that. And so, similar to healthcare workers, right? It's like, sort of, I wonder, what does being a teacher mean? What's the connotation around that younger generations grew up and internalized and saw? What was the messaging that they were told by their parents? What experiences did their teachers have, that they sort of were watching and internalizing? And then what I'm always fascinated about is, can we change that? So similar to, I asked my students the other day, we've seen organizational commitment and loyalty go down since our grandparents' generation.
Right.
And job hopping and gig jobs and all of these things. And so I just said, is there a way to make it go back up? Because if you make the horizon long enough generationally, everything comes around again. Like, I am fully hopeful that we're going to see even things like screens versus analog. I'm seeing Gen Alpha show a little bit different approach to that than Gen Z. And that's anecdotal. I haven't gotten my data in line yet with that, but like at some point you go so far over that next generation looks at it and goes, no, thank you. We're going to try it different. Whether that's we don't want to be zombies on our phone, or we don't want to be slaves to an algorithm, or whatever it ends up being. I think we saw boomers hustle and sacrifice for upward mobility. We saw Gen X push back and say, I like making my own decisions. And again, norms not to the person. And I want more work-life balance. My definition of success isn't my job title necessarily. And then we saw millennials kind of push back the same way boomers did. Hustle, get up as far as you can, as quick as you can. And now I'm seeing Gen Z go a little bit more like the Gen Xers. And so, and for good reasons, right? The idea of the prioritization of mental health, post-pandemic, all the things we could go into. And so, I think a really productive conversation in education in terms of filling the pipeline is, is there a way to make the profession attracted to the people that we hope choose it as a vocation? Trades, we're seeing this, right? My generation and the generation after mine, so the millennials, we were not encouraged to go into skilled trades, right? This is on the heels of many skilled trades people, blue collar workers who thought, I want something different for my kids. I don't want them to have to work with their hands and, all of these things. So they should all go to college. Well, we learned quickly that was not a good solution. Everyone should not go to college. And then we have loans that people can't pay off and their degrees aren't getting them jobs. So people in my kid's age group, he's 20, starting to really gravitate towards skilled trades. My husband's a carpenter and he's usually the youngest person on a job site. Like if you think about the last person you called to like fix your plumbing or your HVAC, it was probably like an older man in his 60s or 70s, because we don't have people of our generation, very many of them, that know how to do those things. And so there's a huge pipeline gap that now they're struggling to get Gen Z in, right? Incentivizing that, hey, you won't have loan debt, come be a welder, come be a and that generation's embracing that, right? They're looking at the millennials' loans and debt and struggle to use their degrees in productive ways and thinking, no, thank you. Some of us are going to go this direction. And so to go back to your question, I think it's a really interesting thing about what is it that they hope for as teachers, and do they feel like it's delivering, and what do they feel would attract more people to be passionate about going into that profession. I seriously hope that we get a lot of really talented people.
sure.
The last thing we should be doing is, endangering our pipeline of teachers at this point.
Yeah. Megan, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. If somebody is interested in reading your book or following up, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can find me at gentelligence.org. So that has the book. It has links to articles, my blog, way to reach out for speaking and things like that, as well as LinkedIn is always a good place to find me. I try to post what's going on there. So
this has been great. I want to thank you again. This is really a conversation that I've been looking forward to for a while, and I know it's just one that we're having different versions of out in our industry. So I'm hopeful I know this is going to be helpful for those who listen. So thank you again.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.